The foundation of the civil rights movement in America had its origin in the church. We paid tribute to that origin by beginning our event with snapshots of the local black churches, past and present. For it was these congregations that instilled the discipline and faith our parents and grandparents needed, that led them to believe that they could stand and demand a voice. And so I begin the recollection of the history of the Hyde County boycott with Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 through 7. For everything there is a season, a time to everything, every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. For generations, the small black community of Hyde County kept silence. In 1968, the time came to speak, and the answer was no. No to a plan for school desegregation that would systematically dismantle and close the two black schools, Davis and OAPE. During their years of silence in an educational environment deemed separate but seldom equal, the black community of Hyde County began building schools in the Bush tent era of post-Civil War America, and created a strong, structured system of education. They understood that if their children were going to be able to compete in the world, education was the key. Why then, you may ask, stand against the closing of the school if it offered integration and an opportunity for equal facilities and educational materials? Why not let desegregation happen in any form that it was presented? In 1968 and decades before, the schools within the black community, along with the churches, were the centers of influence. They created, housed, and supported the leaders of the community. The school's strong, structured discipline prepared the youth for their life beyond Hyde County. For their success beyond the county had meant the continued survival of the community itself. Of the many lessons that were taught in the black schools, giving back and helping others to succeed was at the forefront. Even in the midst of the lingering Jim Crow laws and social unrest for decades, that had been a tried and true plan. The black community knew that closing the schools and displacing the teachers and administration would leave their children defenseless and part of a school system that did not welcome them and would contain no support structure to ensure their success. The black mothers and fathers of 1968 understood that just because someone changes their mind doesn't mean they will change their actions. You see, it had been 14 years since the 1954 Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education, which unanimously held that the racial segregation of children in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Since 1954, there have been many attempts in Hyde County, as in other southern counties, to delay full segregation. Such things as the sudden improvement and refurbishment of the black schools after years of neglect. From 1955 to 1964, we see civil rights protests for equality continue throughout the South. With the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act came new hope. This legislation banned racial segregation and federally funded programs, which included public schools, among other things. It gave the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, and the Department of Justice new penalties to impose on the schools that did not comply. The penalty was to lose their federal funding. Hyde County, like many small southern counties, depended heavily on the federal funds to fund public school systems for all students. In the 1965-1966 school year, the Hyde County Board of Education enacted the Freedom of Choice Plan, which allows students to enroll in any of the schools in the county and to serve as a slow gateway to desegregation. No white students chose to enroll in the black schools, Davis or Pay, and only 21 black students enrolled in the white school, Mount Mesquite. The 1966-1967 school year showed only 7 black students enrolling in Mount Mesquite. By the 1967-68 school year, the number had dropped to 3. The Freedom of Choice Plan had failed. When asked, the black students said that they had not felt welcomed at Mount Mesquite. They and their parents had been harassed, and some parents even lost their jobs because they had chosen to send their children to Mount Mesquite. A black business was vandalized, and other parents were threatened with the loss of their jobs if they continued to send their children to the white school. After the failure of the Freedom of Choice Plan, HEW tells the Hyde County Board of Education to come up with a viable plan for full desegregation or lose their federal funding. Without discussing it with the black community as promised, the Board of Education submits a desegregation plan that called for the closing of the 2 black schools, Davis and OAP, with a gradual plan for relocation of the black students to Mount Mesquite. The first to be moved were grades 1 through 3 in the fall of 1968. After discovering this news of the plan, the black community was organized by the efforts of Mr. Abel Fulford, who aligned himself with the advisory board of the OAP High School and formed the Committee of 14. The committee was made up of representatives from 7 of the larger black churches in the county. The committee tried to negotiate with the local, state, and federal officials to amend the plan. They requested the assistance of Mr. Golden Franks, North Carolina Field Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to help with the fight to save their schools. Attempts at a negotiation failed. On September the 4th, 1968, the black community of Hyde County began the longest sustained boycott in the history of North Carolina. Nearly 750 of the 800 black school-aged children did not attend school for an entire year. Under the tutelage of Mr. Golden Franks, whose creative mind and brilliant strategy brought to bear the support of the SCLC with leaders such as Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, Willie Bolden, Milton Fitch, Alan Long, James Barrow, Reverend Taylor, Attorney Jerry Paul, and Jose Williams, to name a few. Reverend Abernathy, who had assumed the role of president of the SCLC after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968, came to Hyde County to speak on Tuesday, November 26, 1968. Reverend Abernathy was suffering from pneumonia and could not extend his visit, but he lent his support to the boycott. Throughout the entire 1968-1969 school year, there were planning sessions, daily local marches, 2 marches from Swan Quarter to Raleigh and from Asheville to Raleigh. These marches were called from the coast to the Capitol and from the mountain to the valley. Protest rallies in the courthouse, creative, nonviolent civil disobedience like turning chickens loose in the center of Swan Quarter and playing basketball in the streets, sit-ins, arrests, and more. All to bring attention to the plight of their schools and the injustice of a plan for desegregation which they had no voice, but for which they would bear the burden. Tragedy struck during the boycott. On March 24th, 1969, teenagers Lucy Howard and Clara Beckwood were killed in a car accident in Wilson, North Carolina. They were on their way back from scouting activities for the second statewide march from Asheville to Raleigh and other protest activities. Their funeral was held in this very room, almost in this very spot. The heroes of the boycott, the parents and grandparents who prayed the prayers of protection for their children and set them free to do the things that they needed to do. The children themselves, for they were the strong legs, tireless energy, and spirited voices that carried the movement. They had delayed a year of formal education in exchange for a voice in their future and the future of every student of Hyde County, black or white, that would come after them. They were given a crash course in the politics of America and of what can be accomplished when citizens stand firmly united for a just cause. They stood not in the promise of tomorrow, but in the urgency of today. For everything, there is a season. After the end of the 1968-1969 school year, with pressure from every source to end the boycott and not let it extend into another school year, a bond referendum was put before the citizens of Hyde County. The choice? Vote yes for a bond that would fund the enlargement of Mount Mesquite to house all students, or vote no and utilize the 3 schools to house all students on a fully desegregated basis, with Davis and OAPay as elementary schools and Mount Mesquite as the junior-senior high school, retaining all teachers and administration. The bond was defeated 4-1. The grueling year of protests had succeeded. The schools were saved. In retrospect, it is important to note that this bond could not have been defeated by that margin with just the black vote alone. It speaks to the whole of the citizens of the county being given a voice rather than just a few. It speaks to the sympathizers of the boycott finally being able to register their agreement under the anonymity of the ballot box without fear of retribution. It speaks to those who had had their hearts and minds changed or enlightened by the side of their neighbors in daily protest. It speaks to those who remembered the loss of their own neighborhood school, like East Hyde, as consolidations were ordered and their fight to keep them open. It speaks to the presence of unity across the barriers of color and generations of business as usual. With the end of the boycott came a period of adjustment and planning for the new era that was dawning. The 1969-1970 school year was to be the last of a segregated school system. Plannings and preparations continued throughout the year to make ready for the 1970-1971 school year. A different level of thoughtfulness was applied. The inclusion of all parties, students, faculty, and parents were the outcome. Many of the older leaders of the boycott have gone. Of the names that I have come across in my research, there are 2 that still remain with us. One is with us today. Mrs. Pensy Collins, would you please stand? As she is affectionately known throughout her neighborhood, was born and raised in the rich community of Engelhard. During the boycott, she was instrumental in organizing the seafood workers. She is the mother of 11, which gave her the incentive to volunteer to become a member of the Committee of 14. In 2016, during Black History Month, she was a part of a story that aired on WITN Channel 7, remembering the boycott. Mrs. Collins is 94 years young. We present to you today this plaque and a bouquet of golden roses on this 50th anniversary as a token of our gratitude for your willingness and courage to stand up 50 years ago and every day since. Thank you. Thank you. Our next pioneer is Mrs. Gladys Adams Midget. Mrs. Midget is currently residing in a nursing home and could not be with us today. She was a member of the Committee of 14. She is pictured in one of the news articles present in the boycott display in the hallway. She attended the March to Raleigh and met with the North Carolina Superintendent of Schools. She was an outspoken champion for the cause and worked tirelessly on the behalf of the boycott. We ask that her family representative come forth and receive her plaque and bouquet of golden roses. Let's give her a round of applause. There is another special lady that Sandy and I were planning to speak with about the boycott. Mrs. Hortense Burrs was a teacher at OAP for many years. Her father, Mr. John Raleigh Spencer, was a teacher at the Hyde County Training School. Unfortunately, Mrs. Burrs passed away in April of this year before we had a chance to talk with her. We would like for her family to come up and accept the plaque and a bouquet of roses on her behalf. We would like to ask the members of the audience who participated in the marches to Raleigh to stand up. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for your dedication and your sacrifice. The story of the Hyde County Schools boycott was thoughtfully captured by Dr. David Suchelski in the book Along Freedom Road. If you don't have it, purchase it. Read it from cover to cover. It will add facts and detail to those 50-year-old memories. I fear that if Dr. Suchelski had not written the book at the time he did, a portion of the history of Hyde County in the detail of which he conveyed would have been lost forever. For the ravages of time have now silenced many of those voices forever. But for everything, there is a season.